That's you, Bob. This is me. That's you. Now, who am I?
It's Dave.
Okay.
What?
Nothing new.
I think they may be on already. Is this on?
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Mike Van Duzen. I'm Deputy Director of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I just wanted to take a minute here to heartily welcome all of you. Any inquiry we do on a public policy issue at the Woodrow Wilson Center, we consider it a success if we get the right people in the room discussing a very important issue. And I think what this initiative is all about is that we do have the right people in the room, and I hope you have a very good discussion. I want to thank all of you for taking time to come and be here. The Woodrow Wilson Center attaches enormous importance to this initiative, and the collaboration between our History Public Policy program and our Asia program and putting this on is exactly like what we try and do. So I appreciate your being here, and we look forward to further meetings as this initiative goes forward. And we're particularly pleased with the collaboration we have with Yungnam University. And I know that over time that is going to produce very important results. You look back to look forward, and that's what we need to do. And I also, a special welcome to Ambassador Sun. Very happy to have you here, and I turn it over to my experts, and I hope you have a very productive day, and I look forward maybe to stopping in some point during the rest of the day. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mike.
Good morning. I'm Bob Hathaway. I direct the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. I'm here under a bit of false pretenses, and I might as well admit that right up front, because Christian and Catherine and their team have done the vast majority of the work, at least at this end, the Wilson Center end, in putting this conference together. The Asia program is delighted to be a part of it and to have had a small role in helping to organize it, but certainly Christian and Catherine and their team deserves the lion's share of the credit. I too want to echo Mike in expressing our pleasure and our delight in our partnership with Yungnam University, and also to acknowledge the important, indeed invaluable role of the Korea Foundation in making this event, as well as many of our other Korea-related initiatives at the Wilson Center, possible. It's friends such as the Korea Foundation, which really, without their work, we simply couldn't do what we try to do here. I want to say just a handful of words about the Woodrow Wilson Center, because while some of you are old friends, I'm not sure everybody here knows exactly what the Wilson Center is. We were created by Congress in 1968 as the nation's memorial to Woodrow Wilson. In this sense, we're like the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial, in that we're the Capitol's memorial to one of America's leading presidents. But in another sense, of course, we're very different from the Washington Monument in that we're a living institution. We seek to promote research and writing and dialogue and discussion and debate on important public policy issues, and to bring to this research and this discussion and this debate greater sensitivity to the historical and cultural backgrounds which inform the debates in this town. We host nearly 700 public meetings a year. We invite to the center something like 150 visiting scholars annually. We have our own quarterly, the Wilson Quarterly, which is one of the country's leading quarterlies for an educated lay audience. We have a weekly radio and television program. The radio program is aired around the world. And in these and other activities, we simply try to serve as a bridge between the scholarly or the academic world and the world of policy practitioners. And in so doing, to commemorate President Wilson's two passions, scholarship and public policy. So that's a bit who we are. I now want to turn things over to Christian, who will say some more about our particular event today. Again, I join Mike Van Duzen in welcoming all of you, particularly those who have come from the other side of the world to be with us today. Christian?
Thank you, Bob. My name is Christian Osterman. Let me welcome you on behalf of the History and Public Policy program to the Wilson Center and to this workshop on the quest for self-reliant security in the two Koreas. I think when we first started planning this event several months ago, we couldn't have foreseen how timely and topical the subject of today's discussion is, and I think we're in store for a fascinating, for some fascinating presentations, papers, and discussion today. I very much look forward to the discussion. Let me say a couple of words about the History and Public Policy program, which is the co-organizer of this meeting here today. Bob briefly mentioned, said a few words about the Wilson Center. Let me add a few about the History and Public Policy program, since it's a fairly new program here at the center. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Asia program's activities. History and Public Policy program seeks to integrate the insights of social scientists and humanities scholars with experienced public policy practitioners both inside and outside the government in order to provide in-depth context on critical foreign policy issues and to identify opportunities for the effective use of historical scholarship in the policy process. The program, the History and Public Policy program, serves as a bridge between scholarly community and the world of public affairs by creating a nonpartisan forum for the fast but sober, critical, and scholarly assessment of the impact of newly released historical materials and findings on public policy. The program, of course, builds on 15 years of efforts, activities under the Center's far better known Cold War International History Project, which over the last decade and a half has in many ways become the epicenter of a large international network of scholars, teachers, journalists, archivists, policymakers engaged in reconsidering the history of the Cold War with the benefit of archival evidence from the former communist world. Some of our publications you'll find out front. Our flagship publication is the Cold War International History Project Bulletin, which is sent out to several thousand interested scholars and others around the world. Feel free to take a copy, and if you're interested, we're happy to put you on our mailing list. Based on the Cold War Project's Korea initiative, the Center recently launched the North Korea Documentation Project within the program, within the History and Public Policy program. The North Korea International Documentation Project will bring the unique capabilities of the Cold War Project to bear on an issue of pressing public policy concern for all countries of Northeast Asia: how to meet the multiple challenges the DPRK poses to states of the region in both the near and the medium term. As the United States, the Republic of Korea, Japan, China, and Russia struggle to craft effective policy to deal with the security, economic, environmental, social, and political problems posed by the dangerously enfeebled regime in Pyongyang, their efforts have been hampered by an absence of a history of diplomatic relations with Pyongyang, in the case of the United States, the legacy of a bitter conflict, the Korean War, the severely limited access to the country's elite, and the alien nature of the North Korean system. The North Korea documentation project is designed to provide an essential resource for policymakers and non-governmental actors in all 5 countries by first uncovering, translating, analyzing, and publishing the only documentary evidence yet available on the evolution of North Korean domestic and foreign policy, the records held in the archives of the DPRK's former DPRK's former allies in the communist world, which extend from the founding of the state in 1948 through the collapse of communist rule in Allied states in 1989-1991. And secondly, by establishing an international network outside the region which will collectively apply their varying expertise to the task of uncovering and analyzing this historical record. Today's workshop is the second in a series we've organized together with Kyungnam University, a partnership with Kyungnam that was launched in January of this year with a directors forum featuring Kyungnam President Professor Park Jae-kyu. Earlier this year, Kyungnam University's Graduate School for North Korean Studies hosted a conference that brought together a number of scholars who recently conducted new research in the archives on North Korea. Some of the most interesting documents and findings will be presented here today to an American audience. Let me thank Ambassador Sun for his leadership and partnership in this joint venture, which we hope will continue over the next few years. We're very grateful for all his efforts on behalf of this joint project. Let me also thank Lee Hamilton and Mike Van Dusen, who have supported this program from the very beginning and signaled the Center's commitment to this initiative. Certainly thanks belong, and far more so than Bob's remarks indicated, to our colleagues at the Asia program, Director Robert Hathaway, Mark Moore, who was instrumental in both the conception of the program and the organization of the event, as well as Michael Kugelman, also very much involved in the organization of the event. We're grateful to you. In fact, if you're enjoying lunch and a little reception today, it's thanks to the colleagues at the Asia program that we can provide you with this. Let me also thank two key people on the History and Public Policy program staff, Catherine Weathersby, who was critical, she's stepped out unfortunately this minute, critical to the organization and conception of this event, and Ryan Gage, who is largely responsible that several of you are here today, and that we will have a good event here today. Let me finally thank, as Bob already mentioned, the Korea Foundation, which has generously funded this project for several years. And with that, turn it over to Ambassador Sun, but not without letting you know that today's event is being webcast live, so that all of the conversations here are going out on air. So please keep that in mind for your discussions around the table today. We cannot guarantee that to what extent the mics will pick up just about every bit of conversation here. Welcome again. I look forward to a stimulating, fascinating workshop. And with that, Ambassador Sun, welcome, and thank you again as well.
Thank you, Christian. First of all, I'd like to express my appreciation to Lee Hamilton's leadership, which has enabled our bilateral partnership blossom to this stage. And I also thank the kind words made by Michael Van Dusen, who has kindly appeared at this meeting just before. Together with the Korean participants, Professor Ryu Gil-jae and Professor Shin Jong-dae and Professor Ma Sang-yoon, I would like to express my pleasure and happiness to participate in this international seminar, which follows a successful, highly successful workshop which was held in Seoul in May. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to Mr. Robert Hathaway and Dr. Christian Osterman and all other members of the Asia program and then Public Policy and History program for organizing and preparing this seminar in such an excellent fashion. I would like to extend my particular appreciation to Dr. Catherine Weathersby for the unsparing and creative efforts she has been making to moving our joint works forward. I fully agree with Christian when he said that our topic, our theme of discussion is so important and so timely. Of course, at the time of planning of this symposium, we did not expect that timing will turn out to be, if I borrow an American expression, such damned good timing. Well, as you know my President Roh Moo-hyun will be in town next week to have a summit meeting with President Bush. And then, among other things, he will discuss with his counterpart the topic of transfer of the wartime operational command of the Korean troops, which has been frequently related by my President Roh Moo-hyun to the sovereignty and the self-reliance of our defense. Well, the Gyeongnam University, under the leadership of Dr. Park Jae-gyu, the president of the university and former Minister of Unification, the university, which is the only academic institution in Korea that has devoted all of its efforts to the study of North Korean affairs in the past more than 3 decades, highly value the partnership between my university and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Well, I can report to you that the fame and reputation of the Woodrow Wilson Center is now enjoying an increasing number of audience in Korea, thanks to the joint works being done with Gyeongnam University. North Korea, as you know very well, due to its development of missiles and WMD, and also due to the particular character of the regime, has been and will continue to be on the front burner of global politics and security in the years to come, even after the exit of Chairman Kim Jong-il. So our joint works and researches on North Korea will certainly prove to be very beneficial to the economic and public policy community of our two countries, as well as some selected third countries in the future. I very much looking forward to having very lively discussion today with the participation of all of you. I thank you very much.
With that, I think I'll like to turn it over to my colleague Catherine Weathersby, who will chair the first session on the 1960 Blue House raid and the seizure of the USS Pueblo, historical evidence on alliance dilemmas of both sides. Catherine?
To reorganize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. Can you sit here?
No, you stay there. This will be your seat.
Thanks.
Shin, Greg, and Mary. They can s- you can actually stay. I'm running out of room.
We need a microphone, though.
That's right. Why don't, maybe you can share this. Which one are you going to be speaking? Ah, okay, then you need to be near the translator. Okay. Okay. Professor Rue will be here, and Professor Shin will be here. Professor Shin?
That's because you knew you'd
Well, then it, professor sit here.
Okay, let's see.
여기 앉아 계시는 게 나을 것 같아요.
아니,
아니, 거기 앉아 계시는 게 두 사람을 같이 볼 수 있으니까 같이만
네,
볼수
알겠습니다.
우리랑 목사 우리랑 목사
예, 예.
고생하시고
아이, 뭐,
We have a couple of minutes till our time begins, so. A little time for organization. Feel free to get another cup of coffee if you'd like.
third day, third night, so I focused on that. Yeah.
That's quick.
But yesterday I have to prepare. See. So,
People don't realize how much work it is to come to these conferences, go far away. It's really a lot of work to do the travel, presentation. It's very tiring.
and also the function very burdensome to me. You know, I have studied in Korea,
Yeah.
so to accomplish
Of course.
two big teams
Yeah,
is
yeah,
very
yeah.
difficult.
Yeah, no, it's
To
terrible.
we had
Yeah.
already done the Korean paper
yeah.
the some months ago,
yeah.
but the editing, so we didn't finish the edition. So difficult.
Good job. You've done great. It's really, no, it's really good. Believe me, I read a lot of papers. Quite dramatic. And editing people who are not native speakers. Yours is not a problem.
Yesterday before and I told you all that I found some errors.
It's more it's okay. We're just grateful that you're doing it at all in English.
I really thank you. I really thank you. This is very ethnic topic.
Good.
And I feel natural to do a work like this in the future.
Yeah. Well, it's very important for us to have Korean scholars to present their work here in English because it needs to become part of the discussion. There's a tendency for the Americans to just start talking among themselves all the time, and it's a disaster for everybody else. So we need to we need the input.
And one thing I like to say, there are the Korean scholars,
Yeah.
North Korean specialists,
Right.
expertise, but they study in Korea, so they do not command in English. It's very difficult for them to write English paper. So I hope their work and their knowledgeable English, there will be must be shared.
Well, that's a good thing for this project to do. I think it's entirely possible for those scholars to come, do a presentation, get someone else to translate it into English, and then we can benefit from their knowledge and we would just kind of worry about religious groups, religious histories.
That those work must be implemented by ourselves, but the private scholars in the States, like you, have the state government or that there is necessary work
Yeah. Okay.
for both countries.
All right, it's time for us to begin panel one. Let me introduce myself, first of all, briefly. Catherine Weathersby, Senior Associate of the History and Public Policy Program and the Director of the Initiative on North Korean History. This workshop, as Ambassador Sun mentioned, is the second of a series of meetings that we are holding this year is as part of our partnership with Kyungnam University's Graduate School of North Korean Studies. The first meeting was a workshop in May held at Kyungnam the purpose of which was to bring together scholars from the United States, East European countries, who were doing original research on the history of North Korea, together with the history of North Korean foreign relations in particular, together with specialists in South Korea who work on North Korean issues and also the history of South Korean foreign relations. So at that workshop, we heard presentations from scholars from several different countries on the evolution of the foreign relations of both South Korea and North Korea, believing that it was not possible to understand one in isolation from the other. And so for this meeting, we culled what seemed to be the most important theme to emerge out of the work presented in May. And that was what is often called the alliance dilemma. In other words, the tension felt by both states in Korea between the need for an alliance with a stronger power and the need to create security on their own. So the tension between the need for self-reliant security and the need for security through an alliance with a great power. Now, of course, this dilemma exists in any alliance between states of significantly differing levels of power. However, I would suggest that in the case of Korea, it is particularly acute for at least two reasons, if not more. The first reason is that the security problem on the Korean Peninsula has been intense for a long time. So the level of perception of security threat has been high for a very protracted period of time. And then secondly, because the region as a whole, the whole Northeast Asian region, has been volatile and remains volatile. The great powers involved in the alliances with South Korea and North Korea are in a position of making sudden shifts, or at least there's the likelihood and there's the history of making a sudden, rather abrupt shift in their own policy as they accommodate to the changes in this very volatile region. And that then increases the vulnerability of the weaker party in the alliance. And so I think for those two reasons, this dilemma is particularly strong in the case of both South Korea and North Korea. And of course, it's extremely topical, as was mentioned earlier, as this is, in a nutshell, the issue that will be the center of the discussions next week at the summit. We will begin our look at the history of this issue by beginning with a bang with 1968, the year when it seems like everything exploded in 1968. But on Korea, the year brought the most intense, the most real threat of military conflict since the end of the Korean War. So we will look both at the logic behind the severe provocations by North Korea in January of 1968 and the very interesting chain of events that happened subsequent to that in North Korea's relations with its powerful patron. And then secondly, we will look at the response of the South Korean leadership to the United States' reaction to the North Korean provocation. I'm delighted to introduce the panel members. We have an exceptionally well qualified panel to discuss this subject. First of all, Bernd Schaefer, who is a research fellow at the German Historical Institute here in Washington, where he specializes in international Cold War history and is working on a book about East Asian communism and American-Soviet rivalry in the 60s and 70s. He's been an associate of the Parallel History Project on NATO and the Warsaw Pact and a senior fellow here at the Wilson Center. He's worked extensively in the field of GDR history and its post-communist appraisal, as well as on the State Security Service, the Stasi from East Germany, and the role of churches in socialist systems. holds a PhD from the University of Halle in Germany and a Master of Public Administration from Harvard. His publications include North Korean Adventurism and China's Long Shadow, which is available for you outside. Also, American Détente and German Ostpolitik, 1969 to 72, a GHI publication. Stasi Files and GDR Espionage Against the West, and the State and the Catholic Church in the GDR. It's a great pleasure to welcome Bernd. We also have two highly qualified scholars from Korea to discuss the South Korean side of this issue. Professor Roo Kil-jae is Professor and Dean of Academic Affairs of the University of North Korean Studies in Seoul, which I should say, to clarify any confusion, is the same as Kyungnam's Graduate School of North Korean Studies. Sort of a new name and an old name, but the same institution. Dr. Roo received a PhD in political science from Korea University. He's also chairman of the North Korean and Unification Committee of the Korean Association of International Studies. His main interests include both North Korean history, politics, and foreign policy, as well as comparative politics. He has published extensively in Korean on issues pertaining to the DPRK, the most recent being How to Read the Works of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. Joining Professor Roo in presenting their joint paper is Jung-dae Shin, professor at the University of North Korean Studies and director of planning for the Institute of Far Eastern Studies in Seoul. Dr. Shin received his PhD in political science from Sogang University with a dissertation entitled North Korea Factor and South Korea's Domestic Politics 1961 to 72. His major interests include the politics of the Korean Peninsula, North Korean history, and inter-Korean relations. He's co-author of A Theory of Inter-Korean Relations, published last year. As discussants, we have, first of all, Greg Brzezinski, who is Assistant Professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University. His first book, Negotiating Nation Building, Koreans, Americans, and the Making of Modern South Korea, will appear in the fall of next year from University of North Carolina Press. Has received numerous fellowships, including the Kluge Fellowship from the Library of Congress and a Fulbright Scholarship. His articles have appeared or will appear in Diplomatic History and in several edited volumes. Our second discussant is Dr. Mir-Young Yoon, who is currently a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. She has worked for 19 years in the Ministry of Unification in Seoul. She served as director of the ministry's Political Military Dialogue Division, Social Exchanges Division, Separated Families Division, Economic Dialogue Division, and Policy Planning Division. She's had many experiences negotiating with North Korea as a representative of South Korea in several inter-Korean dialogues, including ministerial talks, military talks, maritime affairs talks, and Red Cross talks. She's also been a visiting professor at the Korean Institute of Education on Labor and the Graduate School for North Korean Studies at Kyungnam. Her publications include Changes and Continuity in North Korean Society and Controversies in North Korean Studies. Dr. Yoon has a PhD from the London School of Economics, a master's in public policy from Seoul National, and a BA from Chungang University. So I welcome warmly all the distinguished members of our panel and turn it over first to Bernd Schaefer.
Thank you very much and good morning. And let's start with North Korean perspective, as you can actually clean them from East German archives to a major extent. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in the People's Republic of China, PRC, in 1966 represented the most serious external threat to North Korean leader Kim Il-sung's hold on power since the fallout from Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign of '56. Kim managed to survive the years between 1966 and 1969 by treading cautiously, avoiding to provoke China by swallowing its slander during the Cultural Revolution, and by remaining passive in the face of aggressive postures. Even under conditions of outright hostility, however, China never lost its position as the most important foreign partner of the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Pyongyang's move toward closer ties to the Soviet Union during this period was undertaken mainly for economic and military advantage. Moscow willingly misread the shift as an overture from an ally in the Sino-Soviet conflict. But paradoxically, Chinese preoccupation with internal conflict during the Cultural Revolution freed Kim Il-sung to aspire to become an, quote, outstanding leader of the world revolution. This was a characterization from an official biography published in Pyongyang in the late 60s and translated into English and published here in 1970 in 3 big volumes. This new ambition resulted not only in efforts to spread his teachings worldwide, but also in renewed adventurism on the Korean peninsula. Inspired by the Vietnamese communist struggle to unify their country under nationalist and socialist auspices, Kim Il-sung prepared his people for forthcoming reunification with the South and developed audacious schemes to achieve it, coinciding with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. In January 1968, the hapless American naval intelligence ship USS Pueblo became a pawn in this game and provided the DPRK with a welcome distraction from one of its failed unification plots. The chaos of the Cultural Revolution had turned the PRC into an inward-looking country, jeopardized the conduct of its foreign policy, and temporarily diminished its influence among Asian and Third World communists. Thus freed from ideological subordination to China, the 55-year-old Kim Il-sung perceived an opportunity. As the acting Vietnamese ambassador to Pyongyang, Hoang Moi, phrased it this way in May 1967, and I quote, "Our president, the Vietnamese president Ho Chi Minh, is already very old, and he will die soon. Whatever happens to Mao Zedong, his role as a world leader is nearing its end. The Mongolian leader Sedenbal is a very weak personality, but Kim Il-sung is relatively young and has a strong personality. The Korean leadership is pursuing a long-term strategy to propagate Kim Il-sung as a leader of the Asian people. They are assuming Kim might become the strongest personality of the revolutionary movement in Asia within 10 to 15 years." End of quote. Kim Il-sung readily adopted a self-styled role of mediator between the 2 major antagonistic communist powers, Soviet Union and China, and he became a contributor to the further development of the theoretical foundations of the international Marxist-Leninist movement. In articles such as "Let's Turn the Spearhead of Fighting Against U.S. Imperialism," published in the North Korean newspaper Nodong Sinmun, 16 November 1967, North Korea addressed communists around the world, focusing particularly on Asian, African, and Latin American national liberation movements. While China and the Soviet Union regarded this appeal as preposterous, Vietnam understood it as a contribution to the ongoing nationalistic contest. The DPRK attempted to portray itself as being on equal footing with Vietnam as a fighting country, and hence drummed up claims of clashes along the South Korean border and skirmishes with intruders on North Korean territory. Such allegations of permanent warfare had the side effect of providing grounds for soliciting substantial military aid from other socialist countries. And for their part, many diplomatic representatives of the Hanoi government who served in Pyongyang were very dismissive of North Korean military strength and fighting capabilities in comparison to those of their own country. The Vietnamese were annoyed that the DPRK propaganda borrowed from Vietnam's prestige when it defined North Korea as another real fighter against U.S. imperialism. Vietnamese diplomats pointedly noted that the North Koreans were incapable of creating an indigenous revolutionary movement in South Korea and were not able to defeat the Seoul government militarily. The North Vietnamese noted that up to 50,000 South Korean soldiers fought vigorously on a rotating basis alongside the Americans in South Vietnam, while the North Korean contribution to the war in Vietnam was limited to sending about 20 pilots to North Vietnam to acquire first-hand experience with Soviet MiG fighter planes. Nevertheless, the North Korean political line, which the socialist countries of the Soviet camp usually dubbed as centrist nationalistic, struck a chord with political movements of similar isolationist thinking, such as those in Ghana, Guinea, and Mali. In 1968, the North Korean leader began presenting himself as the leading theorist for the small states, which, in his view, distinguished themselves by actually fighting against the US, in contrast to the mere rhetorical course pursued by Moscow and Beijing. Beginning in July 1967, a new slogan, "Cutting off the limbs of US imperialism everywhere," was repeated throughout North Korea. And I quote, "Vietnam is breaking one leg of the American bandit. We are breaking, North Koreans, the other one. In Cuba and in Latin America, they are tearing out the first arm. In Africa, the second. If the small countries jointly dismember the Americans, the bandit will be torn apart." In fact, end of quote. In fact, Kim wanted to prepare the ground for a grand scheme to reunify Korea under his watch as early as 1968. In his speech at the plenary session of the Korean Workers' Party in October 1966, he stated, quote, "Unification cannot be delayed by 1 hour." He defined the liberation of South Korea as a national duty. Asserting the existence of a revolutionary movement in South Korea, he ordered the North to be on constant alert and eventually seized the right opportunity to act. Since the US was preparing to attack North Korea, as Kim Il-sung stated, and was arming the puppets in the South, North Korean people were told to get ready for a preemptive strike by DPRK armed forces. Following this proclamation, DPRK propaganda began to demand the liberation of South Korea and the current generation, meaning under the present leadership and during the lifetime of Kim Il-sung, who turned, as I said, 55 in April 1967. In June 1967, the first secretary from the Soviet embassy in Pyongyang voiced serious concerns about the DPRK's unification propaganda. It would lead to a dead end, he believed, and in conjunction with events in South Korea might result in an armed conflict, which would create a dangerous predicament for the Soviet Union. These fears were heightened in November 1967 when Kim Il-sung declined an invitation to attend the festivities in Moscow celebrating the October Revolution's 50th anniversary, explaining to Ambassador Sudarikov from the Soviet Union that Kim, could not leave the country because the tense situation on the demarcation line reminded him of the situation in the summer of 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War. Recent events suggest that war could be resumed at any time, DPRK Foreign Minister Pak Song-chol told his rather disbelieving Soviet counterpart Andrei Gromyko on 20th November 1967. In late 1967, after a year that saw the greatest number of incidents along the DMZ since 1953, a GDR ambassador, Horst Bree, made a comprehensive analysis of the situation in North Korea. He listed examples of how the country had been put on a war footing. He reported that people in the DPRK were not allowed to travel more than 2 kilometers from their residences, and that rumors circulated that about 1/3 of Pyongyang's population would be evacuated in case of war. Based on his conversations in North Korea that he had so far confided only to private handwritten notes, he outlined 3 options the DPRK leadership was considering for solving the question of national unification of Korea. First, a major uprising in South Korea, a coup d'etat. Second, a coup d'etat by military leaders against Park Chung-hee sparked by an environment of temporary disorganization. And third, an aggravated international situation that would commit American forces to such an extent that they would be unable substantially to support the South Korean regime. The East German ambassador bluntly concluded that the DPRK had completely given up on the idea of a peaceful and democratic unification of the country. Furthermore, it seemed also no longer possible from the East German point to believe in a real broad revolutionary development of South Korea. Therefore, only the 2 latter variations remained as the goals toward which the North Korean leaders seemed increasingly to aim at. Finally, Bree laid out rational arguments why, in his personal opinion, nothing of this sort would occur in the near future. But less than 2 months later, the ambassador's conclusion was proven incorrect, if not his astute observations. Pyongyang moved ahead with option 2 for reunifying the peninsula about 10 days before the planned onset of the Vietnamese Tet Offensive, of which North Korea was aware. Late on the evening of 24th January 1968, DPRK Deputy Foreign Minister Kim Chae-bong convened the socialist countries' ambassadors in Pyongyang and informed them of the seizure of an armed invading American ship that was spying on North Korea and the DPRK's territorial waters. Kim asked the diplomats to fully support North Korean actions and attitudes and condemn unanimously the serious machinations of US imperialism. Asked by the acting Bulgarian ambassador about the connection between the incident with the Pueblo and events in Seoul, January 21, Blue House raid, Kim Jae-bon replied that it was not accidental, that the US provocation was happening at the same time as, he said, armed partisans acted in South Korea. A few days before the Pueblo seizure and emulating plans of Vietnamese forces in Saigon a week later, the DPRK had sent 31 well-trained commandos into Seoul to assassinate President Park Chung-hee at his residence, the Blue House. Pyongyang's goal was to instigate a military coup and a popular uprising that would bring patriotic forces to power in order to liberate South Korea, quote, under the pretext of a coup d'etat, and demand the immediate withdrawal of American forces. In such a scenario, the DPRK might be asked by a revolutionary South to send military support or come to the rescues of the so-called patriots without being asked beforehand. A revolutionary regime in the ROK, in South Korea, would then have demanded the withdrawal of American troops. And here the plan also matches the goal of the Tet Offensive, which also planned for killing the US puppet president in the South and establishing a new regime in the South of Korea and Vietnam, asking the US to leave. But this audacious scheme failed. All but one of the 31 commandos were killed before they reached the Blue House. The remaining soldier was captured and later revealed the scheme to the South Korean public. East German documents confirm that the North Koreans seized the Pueblo 3 days later in order to divert attention from this failed operation. The ship was seized when it was not in North Korean territorial waters, even so they had observed its movement for many days, including temporary violations of DPRK territorial waters for many days without acting. To conclude, not only the North Koreans, but also their socialist allies became nervous about the possibility of military retaliation by the United States. According to Eastern European diplomats, even the Soviet Union thought it would be best if North Korea returned the ship and crew after they had duly exploited them propagandistically. However, it took nearly a year before Pyongyang agreed to release the American sailors, and then only after the US had capitulated to their demand for a public apology. In the meantime, North Korea not only asked for solidarity against imperialist US aggression from the socialist countries, but also pressured them to uphold Pyongyang's version of the Blue House raid in Seoul, according to which indigenous South Korean partisans had attempted to attack Park Chung-hee. This double message was needed for the North Korean population and was to stifle criticism of Kim Il-sung and the military and party leadership. The DPRK emphatically denied to its own people, as well as to the United Nations, that it had any involvement in the Blue House raid. After all, the adventurous North Korean attempt to reunify the country by force had not only failed, but had also demonstrated the absence of any substantial partisan forces in the South willing to overthrow the regime in order to reunify it with the North. Moreover, the failed attack enabled Seoul, as we will hear, to stir up domestic anti-communist fervor and elicit further military support from the United States. And in a retaliatory action, this is a different story, in April 1968, Park Chung-hee even recruited his own 31 would-be assassins and trained them on a remote island for a commando raid into North Korea to assassinate Kim Il-sung, but this is a different story which never materialized. Whereas the final strike to complete Korean unification under socialist auspices spectacularly failed, at the same time the Tet Offensive decisively turned the course of the war in Vietnam. In June 1968, the Hungarian embassy in Pyongyang reported that Vietnamese representatives now thought North Korea had missed the opportune moment to liberate South Korea. Armed struggle on the Korean peninsula seemed to be shelved for now, given the power balance and the US intent to avoid the creation of a second Vietnam in Korea. For the time being, North Korea had fallen behind vanguard Vietnam in the revolutionary unification race, but it didn't concede yet. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bernd. All right, I turn it over to Professor Sruenshin.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now I'm very happy to present the paper. Nowadays, I think we, South Korea and the United States, have, compared to the past years, uncomfortable the years. But I found interestingly the same thing in the late 1960s. At those times, as my paper shows, at those times we had a very similar experience. So, in other words, those times, the starting time, we saw cleavage or rift between the U.S.-Korea alliance. As a social science student, I'm very happy to present our paper at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I think which is, many people think, one of the most prestigious social science research institutes in the world. And as a professor of Gyeongnam University, now we have another school called University of North Korean Studies. The university composed of the only graduate school. Anyway, I'm very pleased because we are playing a role in cooperative relations between the Woodrow Wilson Center and Gyeongnam University for the future. On the other hand, as a Korean, I feel I must be prudent in the wake of uncomfortable relations between the US and the ROK. I have a time limit, and also, as I told Catherine before, some minutes ago, I have studied in Korea, so my English handicapped. So I just skimming my paper. Let me present. Since the Korean War and until the 1960s, relations between RK and DPRK had been in a state of lull characterized by animosity and tension. The economic rehabilitation and solving the political confusion and social unrest at the time had been the principal tasks in both Koreas. While performing those tasks, the state of alert between the two remained high. The experience of the war deepened the system of division on the Korean peninsula. Under this system, neither side could suggest peace to the other in the true sense of the word. Only intermittent violations of the armistice have occurred, and duplicitous suggestions of peace exchanged between the two Koreas. However, the situation suddenly changed after the mid-1960s. Military provocations of the North increased dramatically and substantially. In 1967, DPRK's sudden military adventurism started with a rapid increase in military provocations. The North guerrilla infiltration of the South in 1967 increased almost tenfold from the previous year. Certain accounts in 1966, 101 in 1967, and again doubled in 1968. The year 1968 can be described as the year when the Korean Peninsula was thrust into its most warlike state since the end of the Korean War. On January 21st, the Blue House raid and the kidnapping the USS Pueblo, the Dr. Ben Schaeffer I showed you. Although there is no doubt that the first incident, the Blue House raid, was clearly a military provocation by the North, the second incident raises the possibility, according to allegations by the North, that the U.S. ship could have in fact illegally crossed into DPRK territory. DPRK's provocations from 67 to 69, with which both incidents were represented, provided serious threats to the South. The series of North Korean military provocations that followed these two incidents are an infiltration by around 120 North Korean guerrillas into Uljin and Samcheok, November 2, 1968, and the shooting down of a U.S. aircraft EC-121 on April 15th. April 15th is Kim Il-sung's birthday, 1969. The shooting down of a U.S. helicopter on August 17, 69, and the kidnapping of the Korean airline airplane on December 11, 69. This left South Korea to face its most serious security threat since the end of the Korean War. Such security threats of the North brought crisis to both Park's administration, Park Chung-hee administration, established by military coup d'etat in 1961, and the nation as a whole. Without a doubt, to Park Chung-hee and his administration, the most important countermeasure was solidifying the RK U.S. military alliance. With the Pueblo incident, it was conceivable to Park Chung-hee that the United States would consider both incidents in 1968 as indications of threat to both South Korea and the U.S., and therefore side with the South. Despite this hope, disappointing and unexpected responses on the part of the U.S. surprised the ROK. And partly as a result of this, the South Korean government began to view its ally, with whom they shed blood together during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, as a country that might not work to satisfy South Korea's national interest. In this paper, I and Professor Shin Jong-dae explore how the ROK perceived the threats from the DPRK and the U.S. responses and policy towards the DPRK. Secondly, what the ROK demanded the U.S. to do on the diplomatic channel. And finally, how the ROK changed its perception and tried to change when it tried to change policy towards the alliance with the United States. After the Blue House raid and the USS Pueblo kidnapping incident, the United States response to the Pueblo incident, against which the U.S. government ordered an imminent dispatching of an aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, to the waters near Wonsan, both surprised and infuriated the South Korean leader, Park Chung-hee. This led to the strong protest by then Minister of Foreign Affairs Choi Kyu-ha and Minister of Defense Kim Sung-eun. Minister Choi issued a bold statement confirming that both the Blue House attack and the Pueblo incident were violations of the armistice agreement signed after the Korean War and the signs of imminent threats to the security of not only South Korea, but also Far Eastern region as a whole. Minister Choi, in his statement, called for concerted action to be taken by all of the participants in the Korean War. At the United Nations Security Council, the U.S. asked for the UN's engagement pursuant to its charter, asserting that kidnapping of the Pueblo was an act of piracy in open international waters, and the sudden raid on the Blue House was a violation of an armistice agreement signed by North Korea. As indicated by this serious confrontation between the two sides, the submission of the Pueblo case to the United Nations Security Council brought up a number of issues, such as the invitation of a North Korean representative, the veto power of the Soviet Union at the UNSC, and propaganda activities on the North's behalf by some communist states. The ROC government sent an urgent letter to its ambassador to the UN and the US, calling for immediate action. In those letters, the South presupposed the ineffectiveness of submission of the Pueblo case to the Security Council and asked them to exert every effort to hinder the North from getting an invitation to the Council meeting, even at the cost of the South's abstention. In response to this order, South Korea's ambassador to the UN informed Seoul that the United States had repeatedly stated that it would not be able to oppose the North's participation had the latter decided so, considering the fact that the Pueblo and its crew thereof were in the hands of the latter. Nevertheless, the South ambassador to the U.S. assured Seoul that such change was low and reported that the South Korea's participation would be advantageous, as the meeting would be a good occasion to criticize the North's acts of aggression, like the raid on the Blue House. Of course, the United States played some role in persuading the South to participate in the meeting. In his conversation with the ROC ambassador to the U.S., Minister Choi Kyu-ha, however, pointed out the fact that foreign news exclusively reported the Pueblo incident and barely touched upon the attack on the Blue House, asserting that the Blue House incident was as serious or to a certain extent more serious than the Pueblo incident and thus deserved the same degree of attention. The minister insisted that the United States be more balanced in its approaches to the two matters. Seoul government urged Washington to undertake joint action against the North and insisted that the South should also participate in the negotiation with the North to resolve the Pueblo case. It was the position of the Park Chung-hee administration that the January 21st incident was inseparable from the Pueblo incident, and considering the seriousness of the former, the incident on January 21st should be treated as a priority. Despite such efforts, however, the Lyndon Johnson administration chose to take a policy of appeasement toward the North instead of supporting the hardline policy of South Korea. The U.S. then held a secret meeting with North Korea to negotiate the release of the crew. The sense of betrayal on the South Korean side was amplified by this move. In the late 1960s, whereas the United States was mired in the Vietnamese War, the ROC main concern was threats from the DPRK. For the U.S. part, the Korean Peninsula was only a minor point and the global strategy of the United States. The level of concern over North Korea's threats differed in the United States and South Korea. Accordingly, it would be very difficult for the U.S. to share with the ROC the same perception on the DPRK's provocations, because the U.S. was concerned that it would be entrapped in a second Vietnamese War. Even if it was natural that the aligned countries had dissimilar perspectives in the 1960s and 70s, it sometimes caused collisions between them. The anti-war sentiment in America and the security concern in South Korea widened the perception gap between the two allies. In a nutshell, the level of concerns and difference of interests were accompanied by differing threat perceptions. The apparent friction between the U.S. and South Korea. Notwithstanding the apparent friction between two countries, Foreign Minister Choi Choi Kyu-hwa, in his report to the National Assembly, Korean National Assembly, on February 1st, 1968, explained that there has been close collaboration between the two countries and that the United States government, through its representative office to the UN, made clear that it would in any event deal with the North unilaterally. The South Korean government, on the other hand, expressed its strong nevertheless, the South Korean government, on the other hand, expressed its strong regret against the unilateral action taken by the United States. I have a time limit, so I fly to the part. President Park Chung-hee and his administration's anger grew stronger. Park Chung-hee indicated the possibility of a South Korean military attack on the north and military withdrawal of South Korean forces from Vietnam. President Park Chung-hee, in his personal interview with a U.S. reporter, stressed that the U.S. appeasement policy toward the North was responsible for the military provocation, and thus limited retaliatory actions should be undertaken to prevent our recurrence of the crisis. As described above, it is clear that the ROK and U.S. stances on North Korea's military provocations during the month of January 1968 differed significantly, creating a hole in the ROK-U.S. alliance system that had been established during the Korean War. And then the most important nexus in the diplomatic response to the two incidents by the South Korean government was the collaboration with the United States. Also, the response aimed to achieve the reconfirmation of the Washington Declaration of July 26, 1953, and the Geneva Declaration of June 14, 1954, that involved the 16 countries that participated on the ROK side during the Korean War. And so South Korean government tried to get the support and participation in the efforts the South Korea seek after the January the North Korean military provocations, and so you can see the paper, and then I go to the chapter 3. The South Korean endeavor to maximize its national interest. From February 15th, 1968, North Korea and the United States started a full-scale negotiation process. And the negotiation process is very long, and at last, on December 22nd, the United States, through the embassy in Seoul, informed the South Korean government of the following. Although the U.S. government will sign the memorandum at the 29th meeting with the North Korean government to have its crew released because the letter is prepared by the North, the U.S. government has no reason to apologize to the North Korean counterpart. For this reason, the United States government will issue a statement confirming that such signing will be done for the sole purpose of releasing the crew and nothing else. The South Korean government, on the other hand, warned the U.S. of the dangers associated with signing such a memorandum, as it could be seen as a formal recognition of North Korea, and thus requested official documents that prove otherwise so as to convince its citizens and opposition parties. When the next year EC-121 airplane shooting down incident in April 1969, discrepancy of threat perception and response between the U.S. and Iraq was reiterated in the same manner as in the instance the previous year. The U.S. Was seen to be taking merely in the older instance by the North Korean provocation. The U.S.'s response to our thinking, our view, U.S. was seen to be taking merely mid-level measures. The U.S. did protest the EC-121 incident through the Military Armistice Commission in Panmunjom on April 18, 1969, which was held at the request of North Korea and as a sign of protest on April 19th. President Nixon ordered the restart of U.S. reconnaissance flights. However, this was only a mid-level measure, which the ROC regarded as a lukewarm response. Nevertheless, the incident did not result in total military conflict because of the prudence of the United States and the pragmatism of the DPRK. As explored above, the raid on the Blue House, armed guerrilla infiltration at the South Korea, in South Korea, and the Pueblo and EC-121 incidents that occurred in the late 1960s were all caused by the DPRK. These incidents escalated tensions on the peninsula and increased the threat to RK's security. However, South Korea and the United States did not share the same threat perception or view of the incidents. Immediately after the incidents, the South Korean government sought several objectives, all of which concerned strengthening its alliance with the U.S. or other members of the international community. First of all, through its diplomacy with the United States, the Iraq government sought the latter's assistance in condemning the North for aggression against not only the Iraq and the U.S., but also the authority of the UN as well as the 16 countries that participate in the Korean War. Secondly, through this incident, the government of the South sought greater assistance from the U.S. for modernization of the former's military capability and the issuance of some type of resolution confirming the U.S. intent to defend the South Korea against the North's aggression. The conflicts between the South and the U.S. eased to some degree as the two countries, at the proposal by the U.S. during the presidential summit meeting held in Honolulu on April 18, agreed to annually hold a summit of defense ministers and that the U.S. would support promotion of a military industry in the South. The result of the summit was significant for the South Korean government, as a joint declaration by two presidents reconfirmed the U.S. defense policy for South Korea and the U.S. willingness to assist South Korea in modernizing its military capacity. Furthermore, the two countries finally agreed on holding RK-US SCM, which had previously been discussed during the Special Envoy's visit to Seoul. After the EC-121 plane incident, President Park Chung-hee asked for military and economic aid from President Nixon, saying in his message that since the ROC military equipment, especially that for the Air Force, is much inferior to the DPRK, despite its manpower superiority, it would be necessary to strengthen the U.S. Air forces in Korea. If the RK's military power increases and surpasses the DPRK, there will be no war. This is the only way to prevent the biggest sacrifice at the minimum of cost. This is the at those times Park Chung-hee's the pragmatic the purpose towards the United States. And so I think I'd better go to the concluding remarks. The militant incidents of 1968-69 against South Korea and the U.S. provided objectively serious threats to the South's security. The ROC government immediately tried to share security threats with the United States and was immersed in diplomacy with its ally and the UN. The ultimate goal of Seoul's diplomacy was to retaliate against the DPRK, to draw the international community's attention to North Korea's belligerence, and to make the 16 countries that supported South Korea during the Korean War declare common countermeasures against the North. However, these goals were not achieved. Washington could not agree with Seoul because Washington's goal was to seek the safe release of the previous coup, and because the U.S. faced unfavorable international and domestic environments owing to the Vietnam War. Moreover, considering their national interests and the international environment, the 16 countries in question could not respond in the affirmative manner that South Korea sought. Whereas the North Korean provocations were regarded as serious security threats to the South, these were issues that the allies, including the U.S., wanted to avoid getting involved in. The next measure Seoul could take were to solidify the U.S. commitment to maintaining RK security and to receive the U.S. aid to strengthen the RK's defense capability. To do this, the Iraq government increased its pressure on the U.S. In the Iraq-U.S. summit talks, both agreed that the defense ministerial talks would be held annually and that the U.S. would assist to improve the military industry in Iraq positively. Meanwhile, Seoul realized that the U.S. could not be a resolute ally, especially after the downing of the EC-121 aircraft. The U.S. response seemed to be weak in the viewpoint of the Iraq. Different from the Iraq, a small country, the U.S. response was one of a superpower that which had to consider its grand strategy on a global scale. The ROC had the opportunity to develop its defense and become more self-reliant in this area. The weakening of the alliance bore this self-reliance. This was similar to what North Korea did, which worked toward building a self-reliant self-defense posture in the midst of the Sino-Soviet split in the early 1960s. I'm worried about the 5 minutes over, so thank you very much for attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me remind you that both of these papers, which are very rich in documentation, I think unusually so, and very solid in analysis, are available for you outside. Bert Schaefer's paper has been published as a working paper by the Cold War History Project, and Professor Ruin Shin's paper is available in a photocopied form for you outside, so please get copies of both of those. All right, I'm very happy to turn the mic over now to the first of our discussants, Greg Brzezinski.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. I'd like to thank you for organizing this and inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to come here to the Woodrow Wilson Center, a major partner with my own university, George Washington, in organizing and creating activities related to the history of the Cold War. It was also a great privilege to read these two papers. I thought both of them, it's always great when you have two papers that deal with the same time, the same topic, the same issues. Both of them bring forward a lot of new evidence on the Pueblo incident, the crises of 1968 and 1969, and if you read them, there's a great synergy between the two papers. Byrne brings forward a lot of evidence from the German archives. Professor Yu's paper brings forward a lot of new evidence from the South Korean Foreign Ministry archives, and so they speak to each other in a lot of very interesting ways. And so what I want to do in my comments is really try to draw out some of the parallels between the two papers, between the situations in North and South Korea during the time. I want to start actually with what Catherine had brought up in her introduction, this idea of an alliance dilemma. Because I think that is the presence of this dilemma is very striking in both papers. The fact that both of the two Koreas, on the one hand, have this need for greater autonomy and to become to build up a capacity for independent defense and independent security, but at the same time they're reliant on a great power to provide that security. And she'd also talked about how at times sudden shifts in the global structure of power could increase the security dilemma. And again, what makes these papers so fascinating to me is they not only occur at this time, which is very interesting in terms of what's going on in the Korean Peninsula, but also because they occur in 1968, a period, a year, that many historians of the Cold War, people like Jeremy Surrey, have called a major, an important year in the overall development of the Cold War. You have this year in which most of the rest of the world, or at least much of the rest of the world, is in upheaval. There's protests and exhaustion with the Cold War in the United States, in other parts of the world, and the threat of Cold War conflict, which had been used to justify unpopular wars and policies in both the United States and the Soviet Union, all of the sudden is starting to become a less and less valid reason for justifying foreign interventions to domestic populations. And so the disenchantment that policies that were carried out in the name of the Cold War had produced could be felt throughout the world. And so the way this alliance dilemma worked and was reshaped by the dramatic shifts in international politics in 1968 was something that I found interesting. I also, in terms of an alliance dilemma, I think one of the interesting things that these papers show is that there's an alliance dilemma within Korea, but there's also, I think, an interesting alliance dilemma on the part of the great powers, because you have this period where China and the United States, both for different reasons, are really seeking to extricate themselves from their commitments to the Korean Peninsula. And as they're trying to do that, they also have to grant more autonomy to the two Koreas. But the more autonomy they grant to the two Koreas, the less able they are to control the broader alliance structure that they've set up. So that's also something that I find interesting, and also something which is very evident in these papers. I also think the year 1968 is interesting in the context of the overall political and economic development of the Korean Peninsula. During the 1950s, North Korea's economy had actually been ahead of the South's, and finally, though, in 1961, Park Chung-hee comes to power in South Korea, and that starts to change rapidly. He initiates an era of rapid economic growth in the South, and by 1968, actually before 1968, scholars have pointed out that North Korea had some aspirations for managing to reunify the Korean Peninsula by developing its economy more swiftly than South Korea's and proving the superiority of socialism, the socialist model, to the capitalist model that was being implemented in the South. By 1968, after South Korea has gone through almost a decade of rapid economic development, all of a sudden, this seems increasingly unlikely to North Korea. And I think Bernd had mentioned that the North Koreans have given up on this prospect of peaceful reunification. And I think this is part of it. I also, a question I have for Bernd about that is, you would think that by 1968, South Korea is increasingly stable, it's increasingly economically developed. The North Koreans must have been aware of this at some level. In 1967, Park Chung-hee is reelected in more or less a landslide, so he's incredibly popular. And so you would think that the North Koreans would become by this point at this point more aware that subversion in South Korea is going to be difficult, but they seem to almost ignore this fact and still have dreams of bringing forward a leftist revolution in the South. So that's just something I was curious about. Another interesting parallel that I found in the two papers is the way that both Koreas, when they're faced with the fact that their great power patrons don't seem as committed to them as they once were, they both turn to similar strategies. They both try to sort of take the lead of smaller states in their respective camps. And Professor Ryu didn't talk about this much in his presentation, but during the paper he wrote about it a lot. In the wake of the Pueblo incident, the South Korean government became engaged very intensively in diplomacy with other countries aside from the United States that had fought alongside South Korea in the Korean War, and trying to get them to reaffirm their commitment to the Korean Peninsula. And similarly, in Bernd's paper, Bernd demonstrates in interesting detail how the DPRK tried to appeal to other small countries in the communist camp and to sort of assume leadership of a different kind of war of resistance against American imperialism. So I thought that was also interesting, the way the two Koreas, two very different sets of allies, but they deal with this alliance dilemma in a somewhat similar way. Another thing I think from the perspective of Korean politics, 1968 was a very frightening year. I think another interesting set of parallels can be seen in terms of the long-term implications that 1968 had. In South Korea, it has an important impact on relations with the United States and domestic politics. Park feels abandoned by the United States and afterwards would seek greater autonomy. But one of the interesting facts is that domestically, both Korea's North and South, in the wake of this 1968 crisis, become more determined to, both Korean regimes become more determined to strengthen and reinforce their control over their domestic populations. In South Korea, Park becomes, after 1968, increasingly bent on eliminating domestic dissent, and you can see a gradual movement in 1970 toward abrogating the South Korean constitution and eventually establishing the Yushin system. In North Korea as well, the system of Stalinist centralization, which was created by Kim Il-sung in the 1940s, becomes intensified, and Kim Il-sung becomes more intent on assuring that his legacy of one-man rule would be continued. I also would say, I guess the last point I want to make is, both of these papers, they provide a very interesting analysis of 1968 in terms of where do we go from here. How do we build on this analysis? What further questions and issues do we need to address? There are two things which I think are important. First of all, 1968, 1969, you have this period which is a high point in frictions between North and South Korea. By 1972, however, you already are getting a major inter-Korean dialogue. And so I think where both Koreas actually pledged to seek peaceful reunification. So how did the Korean Peninsula actually get from the situation that exists in 1968, 1969 to the one that exists in 1972, 1973, and to a slightly more conciliatory attitude on the part of both Koreas? I think this is one very interesting issue. Another thing which both of the papers touch on but don't deal with directly is the connection between domestic politics and international events, and I tried to get at that a little bit in my comments. But how did these events really change or not change the way North and South Koreans perceived each other and perceived their own leaders? I think these are some of the directions that we can go in now that we have a much stronger understanding of what happened in 1968 because of these two papers. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Miriam.
Thank you. I really enjoyed really very much for these two very solid, very rich, and convincing papers. I feel really honored to be designated as a discussant to these great papers. And in part, I share with Greg to add some domestic politics into these two papers. These two papers are much more oriented to diplomacy or the international politics at that time. But and basically, I absolutely agree with the conclusions of these two papers. But I would like to add some domestic aspect into these two papers. First, to Dr. Bernd Schaeffer's paper, it's a little bit different from Greg's argument that I think the North Korean leadership was in need of some forging besides the fortress mentality within their people, in the people. I mean, North Korean leadership needed some sort of crisis to unify its people under the unique system, the so-called unique system, which brainwashing the whole people into Kim Il-sung's Juche thought. And in order to establish the unique thought and establishing the sole grip on power, he needed some sort of crisis. I will argue a little bit more about that. It was 1967, the fifth plenary meeting of the Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party ended in purging many prominent communists by labeling them as a revisionist or the rather sympathetic to the capitalists. In fact, those at the time executed and purged the communists were rather skeptical or passive to the movement towards idolization of Kim Il-sung and his anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare. That means Kim Il-sung already in 1967 already almost eliminated almost thoroughly his opponents within the party, and now he established one unique thought system, and he tried to solidify his grip on power and brainwashing his whole people by his unique system. At the time, since even before 1965, even during early 1960s, the North Korean leadership tried to brainwash its population, sort of Juche thought, but it was not thoroughly established until the 15th plenary meeting of the Fourth Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party. After purging his opponents in that plenary meeting, then he began a full-blown propaganda campaign to educate its people to keep unshakable iron conviction to Comrade Kim Il-sung's revolutionary thought, and not to heed all other thought at all. It means he is trying to eliminate Marxism itself as well. To arm or to mesmerize the whole people with Kim Il-sung's thought alone was the gist of the unique system. And in order to strengthen the unique system and hence keep the absolute control over the people, Kim needed an environment of extreme tension, like a besieged fortress. It was well depicted by the testimonies of the USS Pueblo's crews. The crews of USS Pueblo again and again testified that North Korea was not interested at all in the technology of the USS Pueblo or the missions of their ship. Just that they tortured the crews and they interrogated the crews again and again to force out the admission of their espionage and their hostility towards North Korea by the U.S. side. It means the North Korea even didn't care about the importance of the Pueblo, the USS Pueblo. In fact, the USS Pueblo contained at the time a huge lot of information and then cutting-edge technology of communications. But North Korea never asked the usage of the equipment at all. Just that they asked the U.S. society a little bit and rather more interested in the U.S. girls or the families, but never asked the importance of technology. It means the North Korean leadership was interested in getting their admission of espionage and so making their side as a victim of U.S. imperialism. So it shows that the North Korean leadership was in need of some sort of crisis in order to maintain its people under his absolute control. Of course, I totally agree with Dr. Schaeffer that Kim's aspiration would be twofold. The first one is to become the outstanding leader of world revolution, and the second one. But the two things could be equal importance, or the domestic one could be more important to Kim Il-sung. I'm not so sure, but the other part is to become a president of a unified Korea. So his aspiration of unification and his aspiration of becoming outstanding world leader in a revolutionary struggle against imperialism, is so-called. The two aspirations urged him to make some instance or attack on South Korea. And then why the 1968? First, I already said it's after purging out many prominent communists within the party in 1967. And the other factor is the South Korean economic growth. It made Kim Il-sung a little bit impatient and a little bit anxious. After the war, North Korea made unbelievable economic recovery or economic growth during from 1956 to 1960. For its first 5-year economic plan, North Korea recorded an annual economic growth rate of 36.6%. It's a really world record. Of course, the devastation after Korean War would make it easy to make double the product, but still, annual economic growth rate of 36% is unimaginable. But North Korea maintained that for 5 years. That economic strength emboldened Kim Il-sung and tried to make infiltrate many commanders to South Korea and tried to turn over South Korea. But that economic growth of the late 1950s perhaps gave too much overconfidence to Kim Il-sung, and in 1960, since 1962, North Korea had been spending 30% of its government budget to military expenditure. You may know that communist countries' government budget composes almost 70% of whole GNP. So North Korean government expenditure of its 30% of budget to military means it's a whole 20, at least a quarter of its whole GNP should be go to the military. With that expenditure on military, no country could maintain that kind of remarkable economic growth. So from 1961 to 95, North Korean economic growth rate dropped, but still very high, to 9.8%. And then from 1966 to 1970, it dropped again to 5%, its annual growth rate. Still, it's very high, but at the time, South Korean economy bounced back, and from 1962 to 1967, South Korean economic growth rate was almost 10%, and it's rapidly taking over North Korea. And that kind of strong South Korean economic growth made Kim Il-sung very impatient. So he had to move very boldly. I would add in that domestic factor behind the intention of North Korea. And to Dr. Liu and Dr. Shin's paper, personally, I felt so sorry for South Korean government at that time. These days, it's almost the opposite. These days, South Korean government is more concerned about the U.S. hard line, not soft line. But at the time, South Korean government was much more concerned about U.S. appeasement towards DPRK. But it is very pathetic. But the reason behind the South Korean perception is their lack of confidence, self-confidence. And at the time, as I mentioned before, still South Korean economy is far behind of North Korea, and neither side had any legitimacy over its people. South Korean government was recognized by capitalist bloc, and North Korean government was recognized by communist bloc. But actually, and both sides tried claimed their legitimacy over the other side. Both sides always claimed that their side is the only one legitimate government in the whole peninsula. South Korean constitution is still like that. But at the time, South Korea was a little bit of high ground in that legitimate competition. That was, if the South Korean government is not legitimate, why should the 16 nations send troops to the UN forces during the Korean War? It is a very strong argument to persuade the South Korean people to explain why South Korean people is the only legitimate government in the whole peninsula. But if the U.S. sit together with North Korea and signing some document with North Korea and the U.S., that was regarded as an act of recognition, and that recognition means the damage to South Korean claim to the legitimacy. And as a weaker party in economy, in military, everything was weak than North Korea at the time. So as a weaker party, the claim of legitimacy was the core of the South Korean regime at the time. So losing that their ground, legitimate ground, as a sort of survival, matter of survival. So South Korean government is so desperate to persuade the U.S. not to sign any document or to persuade the 16 nations to support the South Korean claim and condemn North Korea. And of course, at the time, U.S. position was clear, and in fact, the U.S. position was right. The incident was between the U.S. and DPRK, not the UN and DPRK. But South Korea cannot separate the U.S. and the UN, and cannot accept the signing or any kind of quasi recognition to North Korea. That was why South Korea was so desperate to ask 16 countries or the U.S. not to this and to do this, that kind of thing. These days, it seems very silly, and if it happened today, South Korean government would not do that, or rather, South Korean government would ask them, let's calm down, that sort of thing, like after the missile launch in July. But it's because of the economic growth, and it's because of self-confidence. At that time, South Korean government didn't have that confidence. And another matter is, I would like to add Dr. Liu and Sin's paper as that about the matter of transfer of operational control. This is just a hot issue, and everybody is concerned about that. And in South Korea, rather in the U.S., in South Korea, it's just a matter of dividing the whole country. Some is some is for the transfer of the operational control, and some are against the transfer of the operational control. Until 1968, South Korean government was willing to transfer its whole operational control or military command of all kinds to the U.S. because there, from South Korean point of view, there is a big contradiction within South Korea. The first thing for the South Korean government is that the most important thing was to secure the U.S. support in case of crisis or in case of North Korean invasion to South Korea. South Korean government desperately need rewiring the U.S. So if South Korean government secure that assistance from the U.S. and transferring the operational control to U.S. was all right. But in the other hand, it's the ground for North Korea to labeling South Korea as a puppet government to the U.S. because no sovereign country could give up their operational control altogether. That that kind of logic was very hurtful to South Korea. But South Korea government had been rather accepting that accusation from North Korea and willing to transfer the operational control to the U.S. But during the 68 Blue House attack, South Korean government realized that South Korean government cannot mobilize its troops or army in cracking down that commanders from North Korea. If you move to any military or any army, you should consult with the U.S. because we don't have any military control. That's the beginning of the rift or the problem of a minute. Operational control. But I still in South Korea many think. I mentioned one big contradiction within South Korea. One is securing U.S. assistance. The other is securing the sovereignty of its own nation. The sovereignty and securing U.S. support is just contradicting still now. And these days, many South Korean, rather conservative messages are asking the South Korean government to delay the transfer of operational control. But many in those who are seeking sovereignty over any practical purposes are demanding rapid transfer of operational control to the South. Still, it's a dividing nation, and still there remains the contradiction of that self-reliant or sovereignty and the securing U.S. assistance. I stop here.
Thank you very much. Let me first give both panelists an opportunity to respond to Greg Brzezinski's question, if you would like, about how South Korea got, or both Koreas got, from the state of tension that was described in 1968 to the beginning of a more conciliatory posture in the early 70s. Anyone would like to respond?
I could say something on that. I think the Sino-US rapprochement actually triggered all those events in 71 and 72. And from the North Korean perspective, it offered a chance to get rid of the American forces in South Korea in a peaceful way. And they really seized on the opportunity that the Chinese apparently offered to them, that the Nixon visit and the rapprochement between Beijing and Washington could help in getting American forces out of Indochina, Taiwan, and also Korea. And this certainly was very prevalent in the North Korean mind. But I think there's one thing maybe which also you could address over here. This economic question was raised frequently, and I think that's a very interesting point. It seems to be obvious from the outside that South Korea was enjoying economic growth, even by 68, and it was going to overtake North Korea. But from all what I have found in communist archives of the period, in 68 or 67, this does not seem at all on the North Korean radar screen, because they still have this feeling of superiority, which shows also that in 72. In 71 and 72, there are many indications in the files that North Korea indeed thought that now should be reunification at this point, and this was one of the major initiatives, major reasons behind peaceful reunification, not just the Sino-US rapprochement, but indeed the economic gap, which they did not perceive to this extent, I guess, in 67, 68. But even then, in 72, the North Korean mindset is still that there's a superiority in terms of ideology, in terms of ideas, in terms of policy in North Korea. And if there would be free elections in 72 on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea would easily win, because the majority of the populations of South would actually prefer Kim Il-sung. This is still the mindset in 72. But at that period, the economic arguments are already there, and they usually made in connection with Japan. saying South Korea is becoming developed because of Japanese investment, and we have to step in now and make initiatives to force the South Korean government into a reunification on our terms in order to stop this Japanese economic armament of the South.
지금요? 화해가 이루어져가지고 그것 때문에 68년에 남북 그 긴장 대치 상황에서 76년에 그 남북 정신절에서 그
Professors Ru and Shin will work with through an interpreter for the Q&A session.
아까 질문은 이제 그 국내 정치와 국제 이벤트와의 관계가 어떻게 되는가, 그리고 각기 남북한 국민들에게 자기의 지도자의 퍼셉션을 어떻게
Yeah.
Can I just make a few
Please.
comments? In general, we all seek truth from facts, and we want to know what's going on, and whether we're scholars or people from think tank or foreign policy. But if after hearing Dr. Schaefer's presentation, as a recent college graduate and Peace Corps trainee in the summer of 1967, about to be sent to South Korea in the fall of 1967, I can only say that I am so glad that neither I, my fellow Peace Corps volunteers, our parents, or the U.S. government knew anything about Kim Il-sung's intentions or where his mind was, or the whole program would close down. And actually, our program arrived in the fall, and we had a 3-month all-country conference in Seoul in January 1968. So we were in Seoul when it happened, and I don't know what the historical records show, but the story we heard was that the reason that the commandos failed is that they lost their map or something. They were in the country. They were outside of Seoul, and they didn't know how to get to the Blue House because downtown Seoul was very, in those days, even Peace Corps volunteers, we came from the provinces. We saw Seoul was, wow, how do you get around this town? So they raided a farmhouse, and they tied up the farmer. And they asked them, how do we get to downtown Seoul? And the farmers told them, and they tied them up, and then they went, and the farmers got out, broke their bonds and told Yunhap, I don't know. And that's how they were captured. Anyway, that was the story going around the time. And the final anecdote was, as we were being briefed the next day, our administrative, by the director of Peace Corps Korea, the administrative officer came and whispered in the director's ear, and we got severely chastised because apparently no one thought to call their parents and say we were okay, because the parents knew we were in Seoul. And anyway, we were reprimanded for failing to call our parents and instructed to leave the conference room immediately.
Okay. Thanks very much for the human view from the ground.
Thank you for your kind comments on our paper. I enjoyed your interesting and fascinating comments and learned a lot. Although I'm not exactly understand what you'll say in English. My English is not good, so I ask a good interpreter for help. 이제 두 분께서 브레진스키 선생님하고 이제 윤 박사님 두 분께서 이제 국내 정치와 한국과 미국의 어떤 국내 정치와 대외 관계가 어떤 연관이 있느냐 이걸 이제 말씀해 주셨는데 상당히 중요한 문제라고 생각합니다. 사실은 어떻게 보면 이제 각국의 국내 정치와 대외 관계가 굉장히 긴밀한 연관을 가지고 있고 특히 남북한의 경우에는 남북한 각각의 국내 정치가 남북 관계에 반영이 되고 또 그것이 대외 관계로 나타나는 이런 세 가지 차원을 구성하고 있습니다.
Yes, Dr. Brzezinski, Dr. Yoon, you raised very interesting points. I believe one of your questions was to ask us about what we thought of the relation or correlation between the domestic politics and international events. And I do believe that they are closely connected. And in the case of North and South Korea, they are even more so because they get amplified on its domestic factors also.
예, 그 두 분께서도 다 지적을 하셨지만 1960년대 후반에 북한이 군사적 모험주의를 감행을 할 때 거기에 북한의 어떤 국내 정치적인 요소가 어떻게 이제 게재가 되어 있었느냐 이걸 가지고 이제 우리 그 윤미랑 박사님께서 잠깐 말씀을 해주셨는데 우리가 다 알고 있는 대로 북한이 그때 당시 60년대 후반에 대남 군사 모험주의를 감행한 이유가 국내 정치적인 요인만 있었던 것은 당연히 아니죠. 우리가 알고 있는 대로 월남전을 갖다가 우회적으로 지원하기 위해서 극동에 있어서 또 하나의 이제 전선을 형성하는 그런 목적이 있었고 또 윤 박사님께서도 지적을 했지만 남한이 북한에 비해서 상대적으로 이제 경제 성장에서 앞서가니까 이걸 갖다가 남한이 더 경제 성장을 하기 전에 좀 이렇게 내부 혼란을 조장을 해서 이런 걸 갖다가 좀 이렇게 다운시킬 필요가 있다. 이런 고려가 있었고 이제 내부적으로는 말씀하신 대로 이제 경제 침체로 인한 어떤 내부적인 불만을 갖다가 대외적으로 대남 정책에서 돌리는 이런 식으로 나타났죠. 또 더 직접적으로는 이제 군부 강경파들이 이제 득세를 함으로써 대남 정책에서 성과를 내서 자신들의 어떤 권력 강화를 갖다가 도모했던 이런 측면이 있는 거죠. 예.
Yes, I wish I could get on.
간단하게 예.
Yes. Yes. In seeking military adventurism in the late 60s for North Korea, there were, of course, domestic political factors, but there's also, at the same time, there's external reasons for North Korea to go the way of military adventurism. You can see that North Korea attempted to open a second front in a way of aiding North Vietnamese in a roundabout way. And also it represented North Korea's growing uncomfortable anxiety over South Korea's growing economic might, and also to suppress North Korean dissent over its relatively slow economic growth. And when the hardliners came to the fore in the North Korean military, they wanted to solidify their positions within that organization by seeking military adventurism targeted against South Korea.
이제 미국 같은 경우에 당시 이제 1960년대 후반에 그런 한반도 긴장을 두고 한미 간의 이제 위협 인식을 공유하기 어렸던 이유는 여러 가지 이유가 있지만 그 미국의 국내 정치적인 요소가 분명히 있는 거죠. 베트남전에 대한 어떤 반전 여론, 그리고 푸에블로 사건이라든지 청와대 기습 사건을 갖다가 해결하기 위해서 극동에서 긴장을 고조시키는 상당히 부담이 있었죠. 월남전 반전 때문에. 그렇기 때문에 미국의 가장 급선무는 선언을 갖다가 초속하고 안전하게 귀환시키는데 모든 그 초점을 둘 수밖에 없었죠. 그래서 청와대 기습 사건은 미국 NSC도 1월 24일 날 NSC에서 주요 의제로도 이렇게 다루지 못했던 거죠. 이게 관심이 아니었죠. 그러니까 주한 미 대사 포트와 그 당시 주한 유엔군 사령관이었던 본스틸 그 두 사람에게 청와대 기습 사건은 이렇게 다 이제 위임을 했던 것이고, 그 1월 23일 푸에블로 사건은 존슨 대통령이 직접 챙기고 위기 관리 차원에서 직접 챙기고 나섰던 거죠. 이런 것이 이제 그 양국 간의 어떤 국내 정치적인 차이, 국내 정치의 차이, 국내 정치의 압력의 차이, 그리고 관심의 차이에서 이제 비롯한다고 볼 수 있죠.
Yes. In the case of U.S., there's also the reason why U.S. did not share a threat perception with South Korea with respect to North Korean attempted attack on the Blue House, was driven by U.S. domestic political factors. Number one, it could very ill afford raising tension, heightening tension in Northeast Asia. It would be very, very burdensome to U.S. for domestic political reasons when there was a lot of opposition to the ongoing war in Vietnam. And so naturally the first number one U.S. priority was early release of the crew of USS Pueblo. And this was shown in a meeting held on the 24th of at the NSC, whereas President Johnson himself addressed the question of early return. The attack on the Blue House was not even mentioned on the agenda, and it was delegated to Ambassador Porter in Seoul and General Bonesteel, who was the head of U.S. Forces Korea and also United Nations Commander.
예, 그리고 이제 한국 같은 경우에는 미국의 국내 정치적인 압력이 반전 여론이었다고 할 것 같으면 한국의 국내 정치적인 압력은 안보 우려죠. 국민들로부터 국민이라든지 야당으로부터 제기될 수 있는 안보 우려죠. 박정희 대통령이 지금까지 한미 관계를 해서 월남에 파병하고 한미 동맹의 어떤 유대를 과시를 했는데 결국 대한민국을 가장 결정적으로 위협한 이런 큰 사건이 발생했는데 미국의 대응을 저 정도밖에 끌어내지 못하느냐. 따라서 한미 관계에서 실패를 하고 이 정부가 그 위기 관리를 잘 못한다는 어떤 국내적인 비판에 직면할 수밖에 없었던 거죠. 그렇기 때문에 박정희 입장에서는 안보에 대한 어떤 우려 이런 걸 갖다가 제일 이렇게 강조할 수밖에 없었던 사정이 있었던 거죠. 예.
And on the other hand, the South Korean side, its biggest baggage was that the perception in the eyes of South Korean people that the government headed by Park Chung-hee did not manage its alliance with the U.S. in a satisfactory way, resulting in U.S. Not siding with Korea on what Koreans perceived as a national crisis as North Korean commanders attacked the Blue House. And so President Park Chung-hee faced dissension, opposition from Korean people as well as opposition parties with respect to its management ability of crisis and alliance with U.S.
마지막으로 언급드리고 싶은 것은 이런 이제 한미 양국의 대응 차이, 인식과 대응의 차이를 지금 이제 두 분께서 주로 집중적으로 질문하셨던 국내 정치와 어떤 대외 관계, 대외 정책으로만 환원해서 설명하기 어려운 부분이 있다는 겁니다. 다시 말씀드리면 당시 그 북한의 어떤 위협, 북한의 군사적인 위협 능력과 의도에 대해서 한미가 평가를 달리하고 있었다는 겁니다. 다시 말씀드리면 미국은 1968년도 5월 미 CIA 그 보고서에 의하면 향후 5년간 한반도에서 북한에 의한 전면전의 가능성은 거의 없다. 다만 뭐 간첩 난파라든지 비무장지대에 있어서 소규모 어떤 분쟁 이런 것들은 충분히 개연성을 갖다가 얘기를 할 수 있지만 그것이 전면전으로 전면전으로 비화될 가능성은 없다. 오히려 위험한 것은 북한의 어떤 소규모 도발 행위에 대해서 그 작전 지휘권을 갖다가 이렇게 환수해서 이제 대게릴라전에 단독으로 공동 보복이 어렵다고 할 것 같으면 단독이라도 나만이 내가 보복을 하겠다. 이런 그 박정희의 과잉, 미국 입장에서 보면 과잉 대응 이런 것들이 오히려 한반도에 있어서 또 다른 분쟁을 가져오고 이것이 대규모 분쟁 또는 전면전으로 비화될 가능성이 높다고 미국 당국은 이제 해석하고 있었던 거죠. 이에 반해서 박정희 입장에서는 푸에블로 사건 세계 최고의 강국인 미국이 푸에블로 피납을 통해서 자국의 선언과 자국의 선언 83명과 선박이 있는데 이걸 갖다가 송환하기 위해서 아무것도 아닌 나라 북한을 갖다가 찍어 누르면 될 텐데 이걸 유화적으로 한다. 그런데 하물며 본국 국민들이 그런 위기에 빠져 있는데도 이렇게 대처를 하는데 우리가 위기에 빠진다고 했을 때 어떻게 우리를 갖다가 구원할 수 있겠느냐 이런 이제 근본적인 불신을 가지고 이런 것들이 이제 말하자면 자주국방이라든지 이런 길로 가는 하나의 매개가 되었다고 볼 수 있습니다. 그리고 마지막으로 한 가지만 더 말씀드리면 만약에 이제 윤미랑 박사님께서 얘기하셨던 대로 북한이 남한을 어렵게 만들기 위해서 말하자면 경제 성장이 어느 정도 분기점을 넘어서기 전에 체제를 갖다가 위해를 해서 뭐 체제 붕괴를 갖다가 도모했다. 그리고 박정희 정권을 갖다가 어려움에 처하겠다. 이런 것들이 만약에 이제 북한의 의도였다고 할 것 같으면 대남 정책의 어떤 의도였다고 할 것 같으면 그 결과는 정반대로 나타났다고 볼 수 있는 거죠. 이게 말하자면 우리 브레진스키 박사님께서도 그런 얘기를 하셨지만은 유신 체제와 1968년도 이후부터 일어난 이런 북한의 어떤 군사적 모험주의 간에 직접적인 1대1의 인과관계는 없지만은 상당한 배경으로 작용했다고 볼 수 있는 거죠. 그는 또 차후에 더 중요한 연구 과제가 되겠습니다. 감사합니다. 예.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to release a sigh. There's also another very important reason why U.S. did not see eye to South Korea with respect to North Korean military threat. There was a CIA report released in May 1968 which did not see any possibility of full-scale or major conflict, warfare in the Korean Peninsula. It only foresaw maybe small-scale conflagration along DMZ, or maybe infiltration by North Korean armed agents. Rather, it saw more danger in President Park Chung-hee overreacting to small-scale North Korean infiltration incidents, and then leading to major full-blown North-South war that would be significantly disabling, destabilizing factor. And so from Park Chung-hee's point of view, if the superpower U.S. could not deal strongly with North Korea, only in the hope of getting an early release of 83 members of the crew of the Pueblo, how could it come to help when South Korea is really in national danger due to North Korean threat? And this gave rise to Park Chung-hee's desire to go its own independent way in seeking self-reliant national defense and security. And lastly, this is really lastly, as Dr. Yoon pointed out, that North Korea, in doing this, North Korean intention was to slow down South Korean economic growth by creating a lot of disturbance and thereby destabilize Park Chung-hee regime. The results were extremely to the contrary. This paved the way for Park Chung-hee to permanently consolidate his grip on power by seeking so-called Yushin system. And we can say here that the North Korean military adventurism that we witnessed in 1968 directly, if not fully, paved the way for South Korea's going Yushin in 1972.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll now turn the floor open to questions. from the floor. We have mics on the tables, so I think the handheld. You do? Okay. You have to use the handheld, and please identify yourself. Okay.
Michael Marshall from UPI. A strong conclusion of the paper from Dr. Yu and his colleague is that the experience with the Pueblo and the U.S. reaction to the Blue House raid was to push President Park to seek a more self-reliant military defense posture. But what did that produce in practice? Because, I mean, it seems to me that even today, you have a situation where the U.S. and the South Korean military are completely interdependent in their defense posture, as the No administration is discovering as they look at what would be involved in establishing a truly independent, self-reliant military organization where there is no reliance on, logistic support and other functions that currently the U.S. Carry out exclusively. So I'm wondering if this was simply that the President Park wished for a more self-reliant defense posture. Did anything in practice happen as a result of that wish?
대통령이 박 대통령이 그때 그 푸에블로 사건에 대한 미국의 미진한 대처는 자주국방의 길로 나간다 그렇게 말씀하셨는데 지금 몇십 년 지난 현재 한미 연합사를 통해 한국이 인터디펜던트한 그런 관계고 그런 것은 결국 박정희의 하나의 위시에 지나지 않고 자주국방이 지금 40여 년이 지났는데도 연합사 체제를 통해서 한미가
the word the self-reliance a very strong expression. In the last 5 decades, there have been no time the South Korean, the military, South Korea relations to United States on the military side. We have never been self-reliant. But at this time, the North Korean provocations obviously provided the South Korea to think about the military alliance relations with the U.S. As far as I know, the first time facing the North Korean provocations, the Park Chung-hee government or the RK government, the first time they felt and consider the restructuring, not restructuring, but consider this relations is desirable, or this relations, what this relations is, what they think, what they have thought over the last 2 decades, couple of decades after the Korean War time. I and Dr. Shin discussed the last few months. Really, Park Chung-hee perceived the North Korean provocation is serious. Sometimes we feel skeptical because we mobilized just documents released documents produced by the MOFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And yesterday, Dr. Brzezinski raised the question, the documents released by the Korean government, but maybe there are many documents unreleased or destroyed. We don't know. But just we mobilized very limited documents. But even if we mobilized limited materials, but there are many materials in Korea and in and outside Korea, especially there inside Korea. There are many people who live there, like the ambassador's son, who is who can provide very precious and important eyewitness and something like that. But the paper is very the paper is very limited. So and sometimes Dr. Shin said, as Dr. Shin said, Park Chung-hee felt the North Korean provocation seriously, or Park Chung-hee, we can say Park Chung-hee represented the South Korean people's feeling against North Korea. Those times are just 15 years after the armistice. So I think whatever reason the North Korean government dispatched or infiltrated the raid the Blue House or the guerrillas to South Korea, those actions influenced on the Korean government to think about the alliance system. I mean, maybe the South Korean government had thought the alliance system very strong, bloodshed relations, but it is the opportunity for the South Korean government to rethink, reconsider the alliance, and so the opportunity to move from the alliance, move from the bloodshed alliance to another, I don't know, but not the same the past times alliance system. Thank you.
May I add? Yeah. To the question of realizing the self-reliant defense system, South Korean government has been trying very hard to obtain its ability of the self-defense or independent defense ability since the 68 onwards. And in the year 1968, in April, the two governments of ROK and US agreed to transfer only part of peacetime operational control to South Korea to carry out some counter infiltration operation. But the transfer of operational control is not enough, and the South Korean military needed in desperate need of modernization, and it needed a great assistance from the U.S. and the South Korean government, particularly President Park Chung-hee, begged, forced, sometimes threatened the U.S. government to gain sort of military assistance. As a result, 10 years later, in 1977, the two governments agreed to modernize the South Korean military. And the two governments established the Combined Forces Command. And in the CFC, they try, the two governments try to modernize South Korean government. But you should understand the one thing. South Korean government has one contradiction within itself. I mean, I explained earlier that South Korean government needed sovereignty or self-reliant defense policy. At the same time, South Korean government needed to secure U.S. assistance in the case of war or in the case of invasion from North Korea. But at the same time, the U.S. side had another contradiction. The U.S. side was more concerned about the South Korean aggression towards North Korea. In case of the North Korean, a little bit of infiltration, as Dr. Shin mentioned, that overreacting to North Korean infiltration and pulling the U.S. into another war. The U.S. government was always concerned about that possibility. So U.S. government, in fact, restrained the South Korean government to arm itself, very modernize the military. And in fact, through the CFC or through U.S. ROK alliance, the U.S. government effectively restricted South Korea to develop very high-tech military technique or long-range missiles. Until now, South Korean government is allowed to develop only 300-kilometer range of missile, not more than that. So it's the combination of between the U.S. contradiction and the South Korean contradiction. So South Korean government was not allowed to fully develop its military technology. And at the time, South Korean government should accept that because the South Korean government was in desperate need of U.S. ROK alliance. So with that constraints in mind, still South Korean government and the U.S. government have been coordinated a long way until now, and now some say it's not enough to defend itself, but it's enough to transfer operational control. But still, South Korean government and South Korean forces need U.S. assistance. That's why in South Korea these days still the argument about the transfer of operational control. President Park seeks the self-reliant defense, and he tried very hard. In South Korea, there is some myth or suspicion or conspiracy theory that President Park was assassinated because President Park tried to develop nuclear weapon in fear of U.S. abandonment of South Korea. Many South Korean people still believe that it's a sort of conspiracy theory. The reason behind that conspiracy theory is that President Park was worked very hard to gain its self-reliant defense system, but still, after 40 years, almost 40 years, still South Korean military is not self-reliant altogether. So it's very sad. Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing us up to the present, really, with your concluding remarks. I think we've started the day off with just really an excellent, very insightful look at the historical beginnings of the issue we're dealing with today. After lunch, we'll continue the discussion into the 70s. So I look forward to that discussion as well. We will break for an hour and a half now, so you have until 1:30. We have lunch outside. Please feel free to bring your plates in here in this room and enjoy discussing amongst yourselves as you have a lunch break. So we'll convene at 1:30.
Oh, you pay for Spidey. The first story, I enjoyed your pay for Spidey.
they were sharing the spy ship technology with the Soviet Union and the GDR, and they were filming the entire. They didn't ask the crew, but they were filming the entire ship, and there are films about
But
it.
they didn't utilize that information, and
they didn't use it for themselves, but they gave it to
just
Moscow.
pass over to
Yeah,
Moscow.
Moscow was very interested, and they gave
Yeah,
it to
and
Moscow.
the North Korea fully utilize that information.
Yeah, this also shows that, of course, it was a certain game why they actually seized it, and they waited for a long time.
Yeah.
They didn't take it the first day, they waited for the 12 days. And the ship went back and forth.
Yeah. I can't understand why the U.S. side didn't destroy the ship. If I am a president, I would order to destroy the ship. Of course, no. When their crews were inboard and not aboard, and no, after they were docked in Wonsan, they couldn't do that. Already the crews were already.
Well, that was a bit too late, but then it already.
전공은 연구인데 사실 연구하는 그냥 북한 연구 영화를
But if the crew was great, would have succeeded. Maybe they would not have taken it. Maybe not.
어디 계세요 지금? 사이스가 존슨 피스. 저는 그 산타바바라 캘리포니아 대학에서 있습니다.